Hey everybody, welcome back to the Quest for the Bestest. I'm Timo. I'm joined by the remainder of the Backlog Boys. It's Abram, Tanner, and Tucker. And today we are going to be talking about Steve McQueen's 2013 Best Picture winner, 12 Years a Slave. And we are going to be trying to figure out where it ranks on our great, really great big list of Best Picture films that we've seen so far. We've seen about half of them, depending on who you ask. This is the either halfway mark or last week was the halfway mark.
Last week was the halfway mark. I messed it up.
Okay, well, we're on the second half of the show. Thank you for sticking around this great big long year.
All downhill from here, boys.
It's all downhill from here. We're going to be talking about this film, but first, just a little recap from last week. We talked about the 1930 Best Picture winner, so we had continuing a bit of ping-ponging around in the time sphere. All Quiet on the Western Front. We gave it a score of 7.7, which garnered it the 28th spot on our list out of a great big 47. So right there in the middle. A very surprising movie that we didn't really see coming to be as good as we thought it was, because it was very surprising in a lot of different regards. Highly recommend going and watching that episode if you haven't already, because I mean, who doesn't love a bunch of us, more of us talking about movies? Because I certainly do.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's get into it and talk about 12 Years a Slave right now. Someone want to hand me a plot synopsis, maybe on a nice platter?
Timo, I'll go for it.
Okay, Tanner, I believe in you.
The film starts in 1841, I believe. It starts in Saratoga, New York. We're following a man named Solomon Northup. He's a family man. He's a violinist by trade, and he is sort of tricked into coming along with these two guys who supposedly run a circus, but we soon learned that their ulterior motive was to presumably drug him and sell him illegally into the slave trade, where he then spends 12 years of his life, hence the title, bouncing around from plantation owner to plantation owner, continually trying to write letters back home to his wife and children, but never getting to, having to hide his true identity for fear of being killed, until ultimately, through a kind stranger who may or may not look like our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who's actually played by Brad Pitt. We'll get to that in a second. He comes across him. This guy doesn't like slavery. He's like, "I'll go find your wife and kids for you." He does. Solomon is freed and reunites with his family at the end of the movie.
Yeah, and the film is looking at the writing credits based off of the real life Solomon Northup's autobiography that he wrote after he was freed and was made it back to his now grown children, which is how we're shown that time really does pass at the end of the film. So what did you guys think of it?
I think the first thing that I want to start with is where the movie starts, which is, and if I may pull a big boy word out of my big boy pants here, in medias res, which means starting in the middle of the story, going back and catching up to it, which I think gives a really nice juxtaposition, because you start with Solomon as a slave, and from the beginning of the movie, you have no context of him otherwise. You're like, okay, he's working under a master, he's in the fields chopping sugarcane, and that's it. But then there's a fade or a cut or something back to him with his wife in a nice bed, wearing nice clothes, and he's a free man from New York. And you get that juxtaposition almost immediately, and then you get to watch him, unfortunately, slowly fall into despair as he's losing himself in the slave trade, because he has very little hope for himself. And watching his personal strength and his hope for being freed ebb and flow throughout the movie, I think is really, really strong and probably one of the best aspects of this film. And that is definitely increased by starting with him as a slave and then showing him back as a free man and showing that juxtaposition. Mm-hmm. I also just wanted to say in medias res, because that makes me sound really damn smart.
It does make you sound smart.
You got to take those opportunities when you get them. Abram, you have anything to say about your initial thoughts?
I think that 12 Years a Slave is like 93% of a phenomenal movie. Mm. I find myself wanting a little bit at the end of the film, as I'd like to discuss. I think it ends at absolutely the wrong time for a number of reasons I'd like to talk about. But what is here, opposed to what isn't, is stunning. I think that this is some of the best filmmaking we've seen for this entire show. I think that this is a haunting and beautiful film. I think sometimes The Haunting and Beautiful are together, and sometimes they're separate. I mean, this is a staggeringly shot film, staggeringly acted, and it is just so disgusting in its source material and in what it depicts. That's one of the most affecting films we've watched for the show, and I think absolutely one of the best.
Yeah. I think in terms of respectfully and, responsibly handling source material and still crafting a deeply emotionally affecting film, it is up there with Schindler's List. I do have a few minutia issues, as I'm sure Abram does with his 93% exact score there. But yeah, I think by and large this film is beautiful in a lot of aspects, beautifully haunting in a lot of others, and I think it is, thank you. And I think it is, almost as if Schindler's List is like the required Holocaust movie. This, I feel, is sort of like the required slavery movie.
I think what you mean, though, it's in the way that this encapsulates what you would want out of
definitive, maybe.
Sure, yes.
That's a much better word.
Required, as in, not in slavery, is a required amazing thing.
It is a required film to capture that sort of experience in film.
Yeah, especially with the reverence that the source material is dealt with here.
Yes.
Yeah. I would just say that I'm in agreement mostly with you guys. I think it's a really cohesive film. I think all the elements really work together very well. And that while I think it is beautiful, and I think it does all this stuff, it doesn't call a lot of attention to itself. It really just lets the actions and the story play out in front of you in ways that let them speak for themselves. Because the truth about slavery and the truth about what happened in this country is horrible enough. It doesn't need to be heightened by extreme filmmaking. And I think this film takes the right balance by being very beautiful. The nature photography and all the sets and stuff of the plantations are just very, very good. But it doesn't like blow all of that out of the water, and it doesn't ever cause me to lose focus on what is happening and what is going on in the story, which is a thing that I really look for, and I'm glad that this film was able to instill that feeling in me while I was watching.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing I would say is that it's sort of a strange interplay between you're right and it being very easy to follow and everything sort of funneling to this one point. But I did find myself slightly confused occasionally across the story because this film contains a whole host of time jumps. You're covering 12 years, over 12 years in 2 hours, 15 minutes. And that does mean that a lot of things are cut around. And I think that I honestly think there could have been a more cohesive story with more compelling, consistent character arcs if you had chosen to stay within a couple of these time periods as opposed to just mostly from scene to scene, cutting between, it could have been months, it could have been years, it doesn't really matter. And of course that sort of mirrors the experience that Solomon is going through, time just becoming a flat circle. He's stuck in slavery and time doesn't really matter. He doesn't know how long it's been. But when characters will just disappear after a time jump, or they will just appear randomly after a time jump, and it does feel occasionally like there are scenes missing, like character introduction scenes, character interaction scenes that feel like they're being led to, but when you have a time jump, that is just erased and it's moved on from, and of course you're moving on to something else at that point. But that's probably my biggest flaw with this film, is there are characters that'll just disappear, some that'll just show up, and I'm like, oh, who's this? Okay, gotta figure out what's going on. But it, as you said, that's not a huge problem because on the whole, this film is very easy to follow with everything funneling to one place. Even with it jumping around a lot, I still don't, it's clear if when we're in the past, when he's free, it's clear what's happening, that is some time has moved on. Looking at the end of the film, they had done the makeup and hair, so he has gray hair at the end of the movie, little specks of it, and you're like, oh yeah, time really has moved. And so I find it easy to understand, at least, in broad strokes, really what is happening, which is important because I think the film understands that the story is absolutely the most important part about what is going on here.
No, I agree, but I also think that even though this is written, the book was written about Solomon's life, I'm not sure that the film strikes me necessarily as solely a personal story. I think that a lot of the reason that this film works and why I didn't really find myself taking issues with like these disjunctions in time or these sudden exits or entrances of characters is that it has, I think, a lot more to say about the like the pre-war South and the slavery culture and how that affected different classes and different groups of people, opposed to solely telling Solomon's narrative. And I
Yeah,
think
sure.
that's why ultimately I think it's important that we're moving around, because you kind of get a pretty good insight into a lot of the different cultural, mindsets at the time. You get a lot of insight into the horrors of the period, but in a very multifaceted way. I think that because we get to see all of these different plantation owners, in which we create this gradient of like, some are quote unquote better than others, right? I think that's important, and I think what you can take away from the film thematically and kind of contextually and historically from the fact that we are moving around is very important to, I think, elevate and kind of encompass an entire period of American history in a very large and geographical sense, while also anchoring it within a really horrifying personal story.
Yeah, you mentioned the historical thing, the historical context. When I was coming into the film, we learn about slavery. It's taught, maybe not as well as it should be, but it is taught, and it's we know that it happened and was a horrible, horrible thing. And so when I come in, I expect that my characters are not going to have any control. They don't. They're not in control of any of it. And so when I see characters come in and out, especially enslaved characters, it works for me, because I'm like, oh yeah, of course they didn't have any control over that, because the slave owner just told them to do it, or just killed them, or just did whatever because they can. And that historical context, in my mind, kind of smoothed over some of those elements, because I was thinking about it in through that lens, and less of through a film story lens, if you will.
And I think when I mentioned that my biggest issue with this film is that there's time jumps, it really is a pretty small big issue. It is my biggest issue, but I think you're right, is that it makes sense. Like, okay, Benedict Cumberbatch as one of the slave owners is one of the interesting characters in this film, and I'm interested in the interplay between him, and I'm horrified by the things that he does, but then interested by the fact that he is nicer than some of the other ones that we see, but then he just disappears. And I mean, for the pacing of a film, I'm like, oh, well, kind of I would have wanted to see that played out a little more, but they're covering a lot of territory in this film, and obviously Solomon was traded to a different slave owner at that time, and so of course he's gone. Of course we never see him again. It does make sense when you're thinking through that lens, yeah.
I would like, you brought up Benedict Cumberbatch, and I think he does play an interesting role in this. He plays the role of the quote unquote just slave owner, because he's quote unquote nice to his slaves. And Eliza points out this this historical misconception that we're led to believe with that. I wrote down her quote here. Solomon says, under the circumstances, why would I bring up my situation to him? Under the circumstances, this is the best I can get. And Eliza responds to that with, under the circumstances, he is a slaver. Bottom line, you don't need anything other than that. He still does the stereotypical thing, which Michael Fassbender's character also does, but in a more menacing way, is he gives sermons to his slaves and things of that nature. And, Benedict Cumberbatch still leaves Solomon hanging for a period of time, in what is an insane sequence, by the way. Oh, yeah. Just one of the most harrowingly shot sequences I've ever seen put to film, when Solomon is hanging there with just like his feet, just his toes just touching the ground, but it's like very wet mud, so he's like it's sinking away from him while he's trying not to hang to death. And then slowly we see that children are like playing outside, and people are just kind of like walking by him, like looking out of their doors, looking at him. And the Benedict Cumberbatch's wife is, up on the balcony of the house, just staring at him. Just the insane injustice and dehumanization and lack of humanity is perfectly shown in just that sequence, and in many sequences before and after.
Yeah, I am glad you highlighted that one, because that one made me physically feel ill, and I think that the film is just really powerful. And I think there's something interesting about a film that has sequences like this and scenes like the one between Eliza and Solomon, or Platt as he's known at this point in the film, that is very overwritten. I think the film is both over and underwritten at different points. I don't necessarily mean that as either a positive or a negative. It's just something I noticed about the film in the ways that we do have some pretty heavy-handed dialogue exchanges that I think are important and are well executed. I think the one like with Brad Pitt and Michael Fassbender, which we can talk about, but I think that we're able to strike a nice balance of having these more dialogue heavy sequences convey just as much as the quieter ones, and I think it leads to a really artistic film. I think you could have told this story in a lot more of an expository way, which would not have been as visceral as this was, but at the same time I think you needed those sequences to hammer home a little bit more than maybe just the feeling or the aesthetics of slavery and of the period that they're trying to depict. So I thought that was really effective from just a script perspective.
I do want to point out that exchange between Eliza and a lot of the other deeper dialogue exchanges do have to do with this theme of, this narrow mindset of survival that Solomon and all the other slaves have to live under in these circumstances. It really starts out when they're being smuggled down to the south on that steamship, and he meets Michael K. Williams, rest in peace. He passed away just a few weeks ago, who is great in a bit part in this, by the way. But yeah, they basically have this discussion / argument of like, you have to keep your head down. You can't tell anyone you can read and write. You can't tell anyone who you really are, because that's survival. You have to give up any salvation any potential for salvation just for survival. And that is, the larger societal mechanisms of oppression that these slaves are under, rather than just the legal the things that are more of a base level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that theme, that single section, that I think that sort of lays out what the most interesting and unique interplay of this film is, which is Solomon being an educated free man who has to hide all that through slavery, and of course cracks of that show back, and sometimes he loses his composure and defends himself, rightfully so, but then that gets him into worse situations, and you can see that interplay sort of ebb and flow, as I was talking about before, and I think that's what makes Solomon such an interesting character, and of course phenomenally played, I think in a subtle way, by Chiwetel Ejiofor, but his character I think is most interesting because of that interplay, and it's all really nicely set up in that early on in the film sequence where they're talking about, okay, well, you have to hide the fact that you can read or write, because if they know that, they're going to know that you want to escape because you're an educated person. And of course, they wouldn't educate their slaves. They wouldn't teach them to read or write, because then they could read the newspapers and find out that there are free people in the North and that they'd want to escape. So the whole oppression and manipulation of even education and the basic skills of reading and writing that we take for granted are really put into the foreground here. I mean, just the idea of him having to struggle to figure out how to get paper and something to act as ink and act as a pen to write a letter, which he may or not be able to send. I mean, we take that for granted. I have 500 pieces of paper and a pen right here. Like, it's an interesting thing to focus on throughout the film. And of course, that feeds back into his character and him being educated. So I'm glad that they focused on that, because I think that's one of the parts that I find the most fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you talk about the systems of oppression that are thrown out through the film, and slavery being one of, if not the greatest oppressing force of all time, removing the humanity. I think the film it deals with it in a very light way, and that is very respectful to what is being shown. It doesn't shy away. There's a couple of scenes where a character is getting lashed, getting whipped, basically to death, we see the whole thing in all of its brutality, and yet the film also has quieter moments where the oppression is less overt, really, where it's showing us how not only is it affecting the enslaved people's day-to-day lives and their physical well-being because of they're getting beaten, but also their mental status about how the whole thinking about stuff in terms of survival versus breaking out, and the whole just mistrust between white and black people, even when they are in more equal stances, as happens later in the film with the white laborer who comes in and betrays Solomon, which is, I think, a very interesting
Armsby.
Yeah. You were, I forget, Abram, were you talking about the film's representation of class earlier?
No, but I'll take credit for it.
Okay, well, I feel like
Right.
that's it's an interesting like route to go down about not just how slavery affects one person, but how it affects this whole society. And we see that with the whole Armsby example of he is in the same position, but because he's white, he does
He can leave at any time.
he can leave at
essentially.
any time, and he can still do horrible stuff to the black people and basically get away with it. No consequences.
Well, it's interesting you raised that, because I think that something that I found really fascinating about this film is its depiction of its white characters, in particular Michael Fassbender, who I think might be the most interesting character in the entire film from my perspective. I think that I always find it interesting when you see these great actors take on a role like what Fassbender does here, or like I'm gonna mess it up. But is it Ray Fiennes?
Ray
I say it wrong
Fiennes.
Thank you.
Good
I say
job.
it
In
wrong
Schindler's
every time.
List.
Sometimes
Yeah.
I throw a Ralph in there or something, or his character in Schindler's List, right? I think that from the perspective of an actor, it takes a lot to put yourself into that role, and I think that his performance is incredible, but and I think that the sort of thematic and social tensions within his character in this film are equally fascinating. The relationship that forms between him, his wife, and Patsy, while not foregrounded always, having that sort of persistently in the background, contextualizing Patsy and Platt's entire time on the farm there, and the ways that Fassbender acts is so interesting. And I suppose, Tucker, that'd be the one place where I felt with you that I wanted a little bit more out of these characters from a developmental standpoint, because there is the rightful desire to paint a very clear good and bad binary in the plantation South culture. But the ways that this film challenges that, and not in any way defends the actions of Fassbender, but makes him more than just this tyrannical man, I think is really intellectually challenging in a way that I didn't really expect to be challenged by the film.
I do have trivia about Michael Fassbender and by proxy Lupita Nyong'o. So I'll start off with there. Michael Fassbender had the makeup artist paint his mustache on, or like the hair work on his mustache, with alcohol. They mixed alcohol into the paint as well, so he had that sort of fumes rising into his face at all times. And actors close to him had that natural reaction to smelling like a heavy drinker, as his character was supposed to be. And
That's
I'm sure
really interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't even know. Is that done in other films? Like that's a production detail that's like not insanely difficult to do, but from a conceptual perspective, that adds a lot to his character, and knowing that background production, like, oh, okay, that explains something about it.
And I'm sure we'll get to probably the most intense moment of the film. Is that extended long take where first Solomon is forced to whip Patsy, and then what is Michael Fassbender's character's name?
Epps.
Epps,
Epps,
thank you.
yeah.
And then Epps takes over. Obviously, Epps and Patsy had a very charged relationship throughout the entire thing. This very dichotomous relationship. So the actors, Michael Fassbender and Lupita Nyong'o, would have rituals of quote unquote making nice. According to Nyong'o, we wouldn't say anything to each other, just a look in the eye and grasping of hands. Our characters are in such opposition, but we as actors needed to each other in order to be able to go the distance. So they would have just little moments on set where they just like stared into each other's eyes to like connect with each other as humans before they went out on camera and were opposing sides.
That's fascinating, and I mean, I
Yes.
think that really shows not necessarily the human connection behind it shows, but I think a lot of the passion and attention to that sort of detail shows in Lupita Nyong'o's performance, which is, I think, the most important and harrowing and impressive in the entire film, at least in my perspective. And especially considering, as Tanner and I were doing a little research last night, this is her first feature film. I mean, that's insane, and she feels like a really famous, important actress. Of course, she is. But the fact that this is where she came from, and this sort of really powerful role and really complex character in those very, very outwardly emotional moments of yelling and of admitting that she wants to be killed, and that I don't even know how or where or what they did to her eye to make it bleed like that in that one shot, but and of course being whipped. It's all such a powerful, deep performance from her that I think it's the best in the whole film and one of my favorite performances we've seen so far. And if you extrapolate that a little farther, the production design from all facets of those beating sequences is just insane. I mean, the sound design, Timo, I don't know if you like really thought of course you thought about that.
Yeah, I did.
But the sound design of those moments and combined with the performances and the ways that they're shot is just insane. It's so powerful, and I think it all shines mostly through Lupita Nyong'o's performance.
Yeah. That scene in question lasts nearly 5 minutes as one continuous shot.
Yeah, it is. It is.
The scene
Jesus
between
Christ.
Yeah.
Which is an unrelenting way to film something. You there's no room for a break when you don't cut in a scene like that. That's where, sometimes you're like, okay, we're gonna do this scene in a oneer. We're gonna do it in one take, and sometimes it's too flashy. But I think, going back to my original statement, that choice to do that scene in one take not only is an awesome filmmaking choice because one take scenes are cool, but it fits. It's thematically and it's story wise the right choice to make in that moment, because it won't let you go. You have to keep watching, because until that cuts, you don't know what's going to happen, and it keeps going and going and going. And by having it be that long take, just really shows it to you and makes you feel it. I think it's a subconscious kind of thing that you feel that tension build up the longer it goes, and you're waiting for it to be released when it cuts, but it doesn't for a long time. I think that scene is really, really good. It's horrifying. It's just utterly awful to watch, but it works so well as a piece of film.
Yeah. As we were talking about Lupita Nyong'o, I'm going to use that opportunity to go into the wins and noms for this film. Lupita Nyong'o won Best Supporting Actress for her first feature film. Again, just an insane accomplishment from an insanely talented actress. Obviously, this won Best Picture, and the only other thing it won was Adapted Screenplay. Oh, I should mention, the first film to win Best Picture directed by a black director. So that is another a historic landmark there.
Yeah.
Nominees: Chiwetel Ejiofor was nominated for lead actor. The name is missing for actor in a supporting role, so I am sorry about that. I don't know what other actor was nominated. Tucker, if you want to do a quick Google.
Yeah,
for me,
just keep going.
It was also nominated for costume design, best director for Steve McQueen, best editing, and best production design.
Hold on,
So all of those wins and noms well deserved, I think. And maybe some of those nominees should have been winners. I don't know what else was nominated in that year, but
this year was a pretty good year. You had Wolf of Wall Street, Gravity, Her, Dallas Buyers Club. So it fairly stacked, like, for lack of a better word, fairly important. Not important, but there's a lot of movies that are still remembered today, even though it wasn't too long ago. And if I recall, this was like one of the first ceremonies I really ever paid attention to. Having seen Gravity that year and now coming back to 12 Years a Slave, it being people didn't know which one it was going to be. And the Academy did the right thing here. This was the right movie out of everything that was nominated this year to win. I'm in agreement with what they picked, which is not always the case.
Michael Fassbender.
Yeah. That's what I was going to presume, but I didn't want to make an assumption.
Yeah, I mean, I would say he's probably the only white character in the film that has a significant amount of screen time. Of course, Benedict Cumberbatch is there. You've got Paul Dano, who just always seems to fall into these roles. I don't know what he's up to.
Yeah, these terrible, terrible, awful people that he always
Paul
plays.
Giamatti just being clearly Paul Giamatti. That was a little distracting. And Brad Pitt, which I think we should probably get to now, because That's probably one of my main. That's my other main issue with this film. Is
And
he just
mine
feels
as well.
out of place. Oh my god!
I would say, first of all, Abram hasn't talked in a while. Abram, do you have any thoughts on anything that we've talked about? You've been sitting nice and quietly there, so I want to go to you before we rag on Brad Pitt.
He's being a patient Patrice.
That's a very specific reference that only people who watch our Super Smash Brothers videos will understand. But I got no problem pivoting into Brad Pitt.
Okay.
Because Michael Fassbender, I think, as I was saying, is a very complex character who sort of challenges in some ways what you would think of when you think of this tyrannical slave owner. I think the ways that he twists religion is interesting. I think the ways that he has this relationship with Patsy that is tearing his marriage apart is interesting. And it does not by any stretch of the imagination make him a sympathetic character because he's a horrible, horrible man. But he's an interesting one. There's shades to him.
Sure.
Brad Pitt.
Brad Pitt, on the other hand.
Brad Pitt, however.
Brad Pitt is a single shade. He's like a thin window shade that you can peer right through. He might as well not be there because he's very much
It's like hanging cellophane in front of your window and being like,
Right.
I really hope this blocks out some sunlight.
Right. He is very much transparently just a stand-in for northern cultural and social perspectives in the waning, pre-antebellum South, pretty much.
Yeah.
He could be anybody from New York or above, pretty much. And
He's from
ultimately-
Canada.
Right.
The Great White North.
And so when you just throw him in the movie this way, here it's complicated, right? Because ultimately, Solomon was not going to have agency. The entire purpose of this economic social system was to remove agency from people like Solomon. So ultimately, you couldn't give that to him. It had to be somebody else who gets him out, right? By merit of this story matter being told. And ultimately, unless you got some trivia here, I doubt that Brad Pitt's character was a fabrication.
No, I mean, I'm sure it was a real situation.
Right.
Yeah.
So ultimately,
To some degree, at least.
Right. When you contextualize it through that lens, you're kind of damned. My problem with Brad Pitt is not. But first of all, Brad Pitt just has a tendency to play Brad Pitt sometimes, and that's exactly what he's doing here.
Yeah.
As we'll
God.
get into. But when you take the very narrow characterization of Brad Pitt, and then you don't give Solomon any time to find his own personal agency when returning home, you just end the film, it ends up feeling like a double dissatisfaction. Because Brad Pitt is a cultural idea and a thinly implemented character, and then your protagonist, whose life gets completely changed by this white savior, but ultimately he had no choice other than to be a white savior for the sake of the narrative, but it just ends up feeling dissatisfying is the point.
Yes,
At
I agree.
every
I wanna-
turn he was implemented incorrectly.
I want to throw
White
in
Savior
a
who
little.
looks like Jesus Christ and is a carpenter, by the way.
Oh yeah, he's
Yeah.
a carpenter. He looks like Jesus with the hair, but he also has an Abe Lincoln beard just for an extra layer there.
So did you guys look at the credits very much? Did you notice?
I did look at the credits.
So Brad Pitt is an executive producer of this movie, meaning that he gave them a lot of money.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, he
the way
is.
I read it is, I think you're absolutely right. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation with his character and him being a white savior. It's you can't avoid it. It's this really tricky situation. But I think my issues is not with what he does, but with what he says and all of he waxes poetic about the evils of slavery, which he's right. I mean, you can't deny anything that he says. But while I'm thinking, I'm like, this is an insert character. This is a character that Brad Pitt gave them a lot of money because he probably saw the vision and supported the project. And then he was like, well, I gave you a lot of money. Can I play the not racist white guy?
Yeah.
He is the only not racist white character in the movie.
Yeah, and I think that's exaggerated by, as Timo said, what he was saying, but I think how he says it. The dialogue that he's given is so on the nose. He shows up and you're like, oh, who's this guy? We've never seen him before. And he's just like, first time in the whole 2-hour runtime of this film is like, slavery's actually bad, and I don't care. People who are slave owners, like, this is a bad thing and should not happen. You're like, oh, okay, that was jarring. That was out of nowhere. And then especially because he and Solomon don't have a lot of chances to build a relationship that feels like it would make sense for Solomon to be able to ask such an important thing of him, it comes out of nowhere and is so forced in the dialogue, which is why I think it is a problem. Of course, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Of course, this is probably based off of a real thing, but this character could have been more interesting. He could have had a more interesting and nuanced dynamic with Solomon. But as it stands, he shows up, as you said, waxes poetic, which is a great phrase regardless, about the horrors of slavery, is that character, and then does the good thing. And that's it. And it's just like, man.
I think... See, this speaks to the fact that this movie is 2 hours and 15 minutes. I think it should have been 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Yes.
Because ultimately, there was a complete cultural difference between the North and the South. And it resulted in this little thing called the American Civil War, right?
Don't know if you heard of it.
And I think the problem is, at the end of the film, all of a sudden we speed real quickly into a period of at the beginning of abolition, right? We speed into it real quickly with Brad Pitt's character, and then through the text slides after the film that kind of explain Solomon's life. And so ultimately, I think Brad Pitt could have stayed exactly the way he was and been a kind of out of place, but ultimately instrumental part of the narrative, had we then been given time to follow up on what he was saying through the lens of Solomon as he's pursuing the people who kidnapped him in the legal system.
Yes. Oh my God, yes.
Don't follow Solomon's entire life. Show the beginning of the court battle, right? And maybe the beginning of his career as a prominent abolitionist. Because then we would have been carrying along what was just dropped there very suddenly. And I think that's how you could have made Brad Pitt feel a lot better. It's not to use him differently or even have him in more of the film, but just take what he's saying on a thematic and social level, apply it to the character we care about and who we're rooting for, and give him something to do instead of being completely lacking agency for the entire film. And as soon as he gets it, taking it away and ending the movie.
Yeah.
Now,
I mean, I don't
sorry.
want to take too much of a key from the film I'm about to mention and apply to this, because I think this is the better film. But when you look back at Mutiny on the Bounty, which does just go on a long time, but does continue to show each perspective of each of the characters and continues the story points on past what you would have assumed was a logical conclusion, this feels like the opposite of that. Is when you get to that end and you're given those text slides that are just historically fascinating, and that in and of itself is just an incredible story. I'm like, man, I really wish this wasn't white text on a black screen. Man, I wish I was seeing these things, and wouldn't that be fascinating to see how they chose to write this out and have it performed and impact his character and see him reintegrate with society and get to know his family again and meet his grandson for more than 10 seconds. Like, all of that just feels like a kneecap to the end of the film, which is a heartwarming end of the film. He gets reunited with his family and has a phenomenal performance reuniting with his family. But when you get those the after credits things or after the end things, the text slides, you're, good God, I wish that this is my perspective, I wish that they'd been able to trim out some of the slavery section. Of course, all of it feels important, but at the end of the day, I feel like that could have been the first 2/3 of the movie, and then the last third is him post escaping slavery. I think that would have been a more fulfilling and complete story.
Two things. I'm gonna play a bit of a Pitt's advocate here first, okay? And first of all, Brad Pitt, that is.
Not Kid Icarus. Okay.
No, not Kid Icarus. And by playing Pitt's advocate, I'm just reading his words on his casting in the movie. I also think that he was poorly utilized and just a caricature of like the white guy who thinks slavery is bad. He's in the movie too. But Pitt himself said he claimed that he never insisted on being cast in the film, saying only that it was easier to secure funding for the movie if he was in it. I say, Brad Pitt, you're already an executive producer. Give up more of your money and don't be this character in the movie. That's what I would have done.
Brad Pitt has the money.
Get some other Jesus-looking guy to be in the movie.
Get literally any other famous actor. They would. You have enough of them in this movie already.
Yeah, that's true. The cast is stacked.
The cast is very
stacked.
stacked.
You got Paul Giamatti and Benedict Cumberbatch in like bit parts, essentially. Oh, yeah. God.
Second thing though, before I get to the cast, is the aspect of telling Solomon's story after he returns home. I will say, and this is like a conjecture thing. The movie is based on his own biography, 12 Years a Slave, which I assume probably doesn't follow his personal history of being like an abolitionist. It also probably ends ish around the time that he returns home. And as
point.
one of the cards alludes to at the end, he disappeared 4 years after he returned home under mysterious circumstances. No one knows what happened to him. So I think a lot of that afterwards time probably would have been just like a lot of, maybe informed by some historical fact, but it would have just been like historical rewriting and like, what do we think happened to this guy after he returned home? That's an assumption, but that based on some things that I do know about this film.
You can't just keep making great points like that, Tana. You're making too much sense.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, it does, at least with what you said, it makes sense that they wouldn't continue it if they don't really know. By the way that they're treating the rest of the subject matter, knowing that it's much more clouded and much more opaque of what really happened, I could see as a filmmaker being like, ooh, we maybe shouldn't touch this. Like, we can find a way to make it so that we can not have to deal with that and still have it be somewhat included in the film, which unfortunately ended up as white text over black screen. But
yes,
we're not unused to seeing that. That happens in movies. They do end like that.
We brought up the cast, and there's one member of the cast that we haven't mentioned yet that I think is very good, and that is Sarah Paulson. She is terrifying in this movie. She is just
she plays Epps' wife, right?
Yeah, Epps' wife,
Mistress Epps.
She only crops up a few times, but she just brings like an ominous cloud of like inevitable violence and horror with her whenever she shows up in a scene. I think the first time that we ever see her like speaking is in the house when Michael Fassbender pulls all the slaves to go dance in the middle of the night for some reason, and she just clocks Lupita Nyong'o on the head with a bottle of whiskey or something like that, and then she's obviously egging on Michael Fassbender to whip Patsy in that 5-minute sequence, and she plays that role perfectly, I should say. And I really only brought her up because I have a piece of trivia about her. Steve McQueen's daughter told him to hire Sarah Paulson after she saw her audition tape because she found her very, very scary.
And she is. I think
she is.
It's a great character to bring up to talk about the film as representing all these different aspects of slavery. And she is the civilized one. She is the one that doesn't yell and doesn't scream, but she is almost one of the worst. She is
she's manipulative in an even darker way.
Yeah, and so that is an enlightening and very poignant critique, not a critique, a condemnation of the whole institution, where you have your genteel, your nice people who are the ones doing the worst stuff. I think she works really well just to demonstrate that.
She's all like Southern etiquette and stuff, and yet she is one of all these terrible people in the movie. She is somehow like the scariest, even though she is like the most quote unquote polite.
Yeah.
I've got two last things I want to touch on before we start wrapping up. Just quick things, and you guys can comment if you want. I think this movie, we were talking about the cinematography at the beginning. We didn't really get into that, but what this movie does best with its cinematography is use of shadow and contrast. I mean, there's just so much deep contrast used in this film, and of course, dark rooms, black people in dark rooms, lamps in dark fields at night, and really dark shadows being passed across people's faces and stuff. And I just found that like I was having trouble seeing some of the shots because we had a light on, because Tanner likes to have a light on when we watch movies.
It's scary. It's dark is scary.
But I think this movie does use like the contrast between light and dark phenomenally well, and like that was the one thing that I thought set it apart for its cinematography. Of course, great cinematography across the board, but you don't see that very often. It's usually very well lit stuff, and this movie used a lot of nighttime sequences and in the dark sequences, and of course, like that shot where Solomon first wakes up in the brick jail cell, and it's just like a beam of light and a void around him, and like complete darkness, and it's just beautiful from like the design. And of course, terrifying because he doesn't know where he is and you don't know where he is, and it's all like, oh God, what the hell's happening? But yeah, and also one of the surprise elements of this film is just
what you're
that
gonna say.
pounding score, man. Holy shit. That when they cut to the steamboat and they've got this like crazy pounding score going on matched with like this really rhythmic editing, I'm like, okay, this is like, I was not expecting that from this film. I expected some orchestral stuff, some, southern whatever tunes
Which
in the
we also
background,
get.
but yes, of course. But just having that score behind it just made it even more unique and like powerful to me.
The score was amazing. I think that the audio editing in general is really smart. The ways that they will linger on a song or cries of pain or something as we've moved into the next shot is very, very effective. And typically, my eye and ear isn't drawn to that sort of stuff, but it's just used so well here to develop theme and just the sort of haunting undercurrent that never leaves as you're watching that I figured it was worth pointing out too.
Yeah. Well, all across the board, I think the filmmaking fundamentals are super solid, and they do their job in pushing the story into greater heights. That score in the Steamboats section is very, very effective. I understand what you're saying. I personally don't really like that type of score. It's just a personal thing. So I'm not really gonna like dock it much because it works. It works in the section. I just find nowadays, more contemporarily stuff that sounds like that with the really, really hard percussion, metallic percussion is a little overwrought and overused. But I think it's not a critique of this film because this is before that trend really came about in film scoring.
It's just an era convention you're not a huge fan of.
Yeah. I mean, it's nothing, no sweat off of the film's back for that. But Abram, you're right. Tucker, you're right about that shot in the Black Void. The way the film just uses these, film-like elements, filmic language to convey our narrative and to really drive home its points works very, very well.
Last piece of trivia that I have, and I only like to bring up film scheduling, shooting stuff when it's impressive, and this one is. The filming was done on location in Louisiana with one camera over the course of 35 days.
Whoa. Oh my God. That is not long at all.
And when Steve McQueen mentioned that at the Directors Guild Award, to his Directors Guild peers, they laughed just because of like how insanely efficient that is. I think it says Catherine Bigelow specifically applauded him on how efficient his filmmaking is.
Just imagine a quiet room and Catherine Bigelow like in the corner, like, yeah, good job, Steve.
And it is. For how efficiently this film was made, it is insane how good it is. Because we brought up our small tiny issues with it, and but I think by and large it is an incredibly emotionally moving and incredibly well made. It takes some chances with like the cinematography that highlights shadows and those score choices. I think it separates itself from a lot of other like historical biopics, while also setting itself into the upper echelon of them as well.
I agree. I think that's all because of Steve McQueen. I mean, we're talking about these performances, we're talking about cinematography, we're talking about the set, the efficiency, the set design, all of that. I mean, he just had such a wonderful controlling hand over all of this, and it feels so focused. And I think that's because of his vision and his passion for the project and all of that.
Yes.
Good job, Steve.
Good job, Steve.
I'm doing the Catherine Bigelow. Good job, Steve.
All right. Well, yeah, we've talked enough. Let's see where the numbers lie. How about?
Let's do it.
All right. I know exactly what
numbers never lie.
I've got one in
Timo.
there.
I've got mine ready to go.
3,
I've got mine as
2,
well.
1, go.
Well,
There we go.
We are very,
There it
very, once again, similar to last week, actually. We're quite united in our vote distribution. The final score of this film, if I get the decimal places right, is going to be a 9.3. So shoots way up. That's way up on the top of the list. The point breakdown, starting from the bottom, Tanner gave it a 9 flat. Tucker gave it a 9.2. I gave it a 9.5, and Abram gave it a 9.6. So right in there, almost within half a point of each other. 9.3, though, looking way up on this list, is going to go in between Godfather Part 2 and The Silence of the Lambs. So way up.
Good company.
Great company up there at the top of the film, of our whole list. Actually, I'm mistaken. I was looking at the list wrong.
Say.
It's in between Return of the King and Silence of the Lambs. So it will go one below Return of the King and at place number 6 out of 48 now.
Yes.
This list discrepancy should be fixed.
Well, it's we've got lots of lists floating around, lots of sources. But number 6 is the official spot ranking of 12 Years a Slave. 6 is half of 12. It's perfect.
Perfect, I guess. For a weird, I should say. Can I go on a rant? I know we don't. I know we're pressed for time, but can I go on a rant about IMDb trivia, because that's where I get a lot of my trivia from. I had to dig for nuggets in this one, because a lot of it is just like, did you know that this is like the third film with a number in the title to win Best Picture? I'm like, I don't care. Give me the interesting stuff. And then all of it is also like, did you know that Michael Fassbender and Chiwetel Ejiofor and Benedict Cumberbatch are all in Marvel movies? Yeah, great, thanks.
That really helps us figure out if this movie is good or not.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well,
it's just a lot of stuff like that.
I found that quite a great discussion of a very good film, a very important film. You know, we talked about the responsibility to tell an important story well, and this film definitely handles that responsibility well and executes on it. And I think that is definitely worthy of praise among all the other elements of this film that are worthy of praise, because yeah, it's good and we liked it. And if a number 6 place on our huge list, almost 50 films, says anything, maybe you should watch it as well if you haven't already. So, shall we spin that wheel?
Let's spin the wheel. Let's do it.
All right.
Let's see if we bounce all the way back to the 1920s or the 1930s again. How about that?
I'm really hoping to go all the way back in time. But here we go.
Yes.
Tanner, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Sock it to me.
Wheel, what's your deal? Give us a movie that makes us squeal. Is it on digital or is it on real? Wheel, what's your deal?
And the number is 20. So,
nice in the middle there.
What film is film number 20, Mr. Tucker?
I got a big dumb smile on my face because we're watching a big dumb movie this week. We're going to be talking about a movie, the 1976 Best Picture winner, directed by John G. Avildsen, which of course you know as the director of Karate Kid Part 3, Karate Kid Part 2, Karate Kid, Rocky 5, and of course Rocky, starring Sylvester Stallone.
Rocky.
We're watching Rocky?
Yeah, we're watching Rocky.
Wow, I actually really want to see this movie.
A flat 2 hours.
Perfect.
Nice.
This is a perfect choice.
Thank you, Will.
Adrian, me, Rocky Sylvester.
No. Well, Rocky time.
Rocky
time.
Oh, I can't wait.
We're going to get into it. I mean, wow.
Will we come out victorious, or are we going to be down for the count with Rocky?
Now that's a pun to end on right there.
That is. And so, I'll bid you farewell. Thanks for the discussion, and we'll see you next week. Peace.
Everyone recording.
I'm recording.
Nope.
Because of my excellent scheduling brain, don't really have a comment this week because the episode's been out for like 2 hours only. Unless we do have a comment. I haven't checked in 2 hours.
We don't.
Okay.
I would be surprised if we did.
I would be surprised too. So we can just kind of gloss over it this week.
All right.
Okay.
And I'm
Oh,
recording.
wait. There's one comment. Oh,
There is?
It's a porn butt comment.
Oh, okay. That's why. So there's one comment. Nothing shows up.
Should we shout out the porn bot comment? Our featured comment is, "Ooh, what's this link? Oh no. Oh no."